In the winter of 1887, along the jagged coastline of Maine, where Atlantic storms carved deep scars into granite cliffs, the last living member of the Dyer family drew her final breath in a farmhouse that had sheltered 7 generations of cursed blood. Martha Dyer, barely 16 years old, died with the same terrible symptoms that had claimed every child born to her lineage for over 40 years. Her death marked the end of what medical historians now consider the most documented case of inherited suffering in American history. But the mystery of what killed the Dyers and why their children died in such horrifying synchronicity remains unsolved to this day. What I'm about to reveal has been hidden in Maine State Archives for over a century. Medical records that were deliberately buried, eyewitness accounts that were dismissed as folklore, and physical evidence that challenges everything modern science believes about genetic inheritance and human consciousness. The truth about the Dyer bloodline will force you to question whether some diseases can transcend the boundaries of individual bodies and whether suffering itself can be encoded into DNA. Before we descend into this medical nightmare that unfolded on the rocky shores of Maine, I need to know something about you. This channel explores the darkest corners of documented history, places where science meets horror and rational explanation crumbles in the face of impossible evidence. If you're brave enough to confront mysteries that medical textbooks refuse to acknowledge, hit that subscribe button now and tell me in the comments what state you're watching from, because what happened to the Dyers occurred in small-town America, in communities that might be disturbingly similar to your own. The nightmare began not with Martha's death in 1887, but with her ancestors' arrival in Maine over a century earlier. Tonight, we're going to trace the corruption of an entire bloodline from its innocent origins to its terrifying conclusion. The Dyer family's tragic destiny began in the autumn of 1782 when Thomas Dyer, a Continental Army veteran bearing scars from 3 major battles, claimed 200 acres of rocky coastal land near what would become the town of Woolwich, Maine. The land grant, compensation for his military service, consisted of dense pine forests, salt marshes, and cliff-top fields that faced the unforgiving North Atlantic. Thomas had survived the Revolution, but the war had left him with a shattered left arm and a persistent cough that suggested his lungs had been damaged by gunpowder smoke. What Thomas couldn't have known was that his chosen homestead sat atop geological formations containing unusually high concentrations of naturally occurring radioactive minerals. The granite bedrock beneath his farm contained veins of pitchblende and uraninite, elements that wouldn't be understood by science for another century. The well he dug in 1783 drew water that flowed through these radioactive deposits, and the crops he planted absorbed trace amounts of uranium and radium from the contaminated soil. Thomas married Rebecca Hawthorne in 1784, a local woman whose family had emigrated from Salem, Massachusetts after the witch trials. Rebecca brought to the marriage her own genetic burden, a rare hereditary condition that affected collagen production, making her descendants prone to joint problems and fragile connective tissue. The combination of Rebecca's genetic predisposition and the environmental contamination of the Dyer homestead would prove catastrophic for their offspring. The first generation of Dyers, born on the contaminated land, showed only subtle signs of what would become the family curse. Thomas and Rebecca's 4 children, Jonathan, born 1785, Sarah, born 1787, Ezekiel, born 1789, and Mercy, born 1791, grew to adulthood with no apparent health problems beyond occasional joint stiffness and a tendency to bruise easily. But as they reached their 20s and began having children of their own, the true horror of the Dyer inheritance began to manifest. Dr. Amos Whitfield, the traveling physician who served the scattered communities of central Maine, first documented unusual symptoms in the Dyer grandchildren in his medical journal dated September 1820. His handwritten notes, discovered in the Maine Historical Society archives in 1973, provide the earliest clinical description of what would become known locally as the Dyer affliction. I was summoned to the Dyer homestead to examine young Benjamin, age 12, son of Jonathan Dyer. Dr. Whitfield wrote, "The boy presented with symptoms unlike any I have encountered in 30 years of medical practice. His joints showed signs of premature arthritis, yet he reported no pain. His skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed the network of blood vessels beneath. Most disturbing was his claim that he could feel his sister Ruth's emotions as if they were his own." Dr. Whitfield's examination of Ruth Dyer, Benjamin's 10-year-old sister, revealed identical symptoms appearing at exactly the same rate of progression. When he pressed on Benjamin's swollen knee, Ruth winced in apparent sympathy. When Ruth complained of headaches, Benjamin would simultaneously reach for his own temple. The siblings seemed connected by some invisible neural network that allowed them to share sensations across physical space. I have observed many cases of sympathetic illness among family members, Dr. Whitfield continued in his notes, but what I witnessed in the Dyer children suggests a connection that transcends normal human physiology. When I applied pressure to Benjamin's spine, Ruth immediately arched her back in apparent discomfort, despite being in a different room. The children appear to be experiencing a shared nervous system distributed across two separate bodies. By 1825, similar symptoms had appeared in 6 more Dyer grandchildren across 3 different households. The pattern was invariable: healthy development until age 10 or 11, followed by rapid onset of joint deterioration, skin transparency, and the eerie synchronization of symptoms between siblings. Dr. Whitfield began making monthly visits to document the progression of what he increasingly believed was a new form of inherited disease. The most disturbing aspect of the condition was not the physical symptoms, but the psychological changes that accompanied them. As the children's bodies deteriorated, their personalities seemed to merge into a collective consciousness that defied rational explanation. Siblings would finish each other's sentences, wake at identical times, and show emotional responses to events happening to their brothers and sisters miles away. Who married into a neighboring family, kept a detailed diary of her observations about her afflicted nieces and nephews. Her entries, preserved in the Woolwich Historical Society, provide a civilian perspective on the family's growing horror. "Young Samuel and his brother David have begun speaking in unison," she wrote in March 1826, "not just completing each other's thoughts, but pronouncing the exact same words at precisely the same moment, as if controlled by a single mind. When I asked Samuel about his day, David answered before Samuel could open his mouth. When David tried to explain, Samuel's lips moved in perfect synchronization with his brother's voice. The phenomenon extended beyond simple verbal communication. The afflicted children showed identical preferences in food, clothing, and activities, despite being raised in separate households. They would draw the same pictures without consulting each other, choose identical books from different libraries, and even develop the same minor injuries within days of each other. Dr. Whitfield's colleague, Dr. Marcus Brennan from the Maine Medical College in Brunswick, joined the investigation in 1827 after receiving reports of the unusual family cluster. Dr. Brennan brought with him the latest medical instruments available to early 19th century physicians, including a primitive stethoscope and a collection of surgical tools for taking tissue samples. His examination of the Dyer children revealed physiological abnormalities that challenged contemporary understanding of human anatomy. Blood samples showed unusual cellular structures that he couldn't classify according to existing medical knowledge. The children's nervous systems appeared to generate electrical activity at frequencies that his instruments could barely detect. Most remarkably, when he measured the heartbeats of affected siblings, they synchronized within minutes of being in the same room together. The Dyer children represent either an unprecedented genetic mutation or evidence of physiological phenomena that our current medical science cannot accommodate. Dr. Brennan wrote in a report to the Massachusetts Medical Society, "Their nervous systems appear to function as components of a larger biological network that spans multiple individual bodies. The implications for our understanding of human consciousness and individual identity are profound and deeply disturbing." By 1830, the Dyer affliction had begun attracting attention from beyond the medical community. Reports of the synchronous children reached religious leaders who interpreted the phenomenon through theological rather than scientific frameworks. Reverend Josiah Blackwood of the First Congregational Church in Bath traveled to Woolwich to observe the family and determine whether supernatural forces were involved. Reverend Blackwood's account, published in the New England Religious Quarterly in 1831, reflected the era's struggle to reconcile scientific observation with religious doctrine. "I have witnessed phenomena in the Dyer household that challenge our understanding of both medical science and divine providence," he wrote. "The children speak with one voice, move with synchronized precision, and seem to share thoughts and sensations in ways that suggest either divine blessing or supernatural curse. Their apparent lack of individual consciousness raises troubling questions about the nature of the human soul and whether it can be divided among multiple bodies." The religious interpretation of the Dyer affliction divided the local community. Some families viewed the synchronized children as blessed vessels chosen by God for unknown purposes. Others saw them as evidence of demonic possession or generational curse, requiring exorcism or banishment. The controversy led to the Dyer family's increasing isolation from their neighbors and the broader community. As the 1830s progressed, the pattern of inheritance became more clearly defined and increasingly alarming. Dr. Whitfield's records showed that the condition appeared exclusively in third-generation descendants of Thomas and Rebecca Dyer. First- and second-generation family members remained healthy throughout their lives, but their children inevitably developed symptoms by early adolescence. More disturbing was the accelerating timeline of the disease's progression. The earliest cases had allowed affected children to reach their late teens before becoming completely incapacitated. But each subsequent group of siblings showed symptoms appearing earlier and progressing more rapidly. Children born in the 1830s began showing signs of deterioration by age 8 or 9, and their decline was more severe than their older cousins had experienced. Dr. Whitfield began corresponding with physicians in Boston and New York, sharing his documentation of the Dyer case and seeking insights from colleagues who might have encountered similar phenomena. The responses he received reflected the medical community's bewilderment and growing concern about the implications of the case. Dr. Harrison Phillips of Massachusetts General Hospital wrote in reply, "Your descriptions of the Dyer children suggest a form of inherited condition that transcends our current understanding of genetic transmission. The synchronization of symptoms across siblings implies a biological connection that defies known principles of human physiology. I fear we may be witnessing the emergence of a new form of human variant, one that challenges our basic assumptions about individual consciousness and physical autonomy." The medical establishment's interest in the Dyer case led to increasingly invasive examinations and experimental treatments that often caused more harm than healing. Physicians arrived from distant cities carrying experimental instruments and untested theories about the cause of the children's condition. The Dyer family, desperate for any hope of cure or relief, submitted their children to procedures that would be considered barbaric by modern standards. Dr. Frederick Walsh, from the College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York, attempted to sever the sympathetic connection between affected siblings by surgically damaging specific nerves in their spinal cords. The procedure, performed without anesthesia in 1835, resulted in partial paralysis for 3 children while leaving their synchronized symptoms completely unchanged. Another physician, Dr. Augustus Hartwell from Philadelphia, theorized that the condition resulted from magnetic imbalance in the children's blood. His treatment involved exposing the children to powerful electromagnets for hours at a time causing severe burns and neurological damage without providing any therapeutic benefit. The failure of these experimental treatments, combined with the children's steadily worsening condition, led many families to abandon hope for medical cure and instead focus on making their afflicted children comfortable during their inevitable decline. But comfort proved elusive as the symptoms continued evolving in ways that challenged everyone's ability to cope. By 1840, the affected children had begun experiencing shared dreams and synchronized sleep patterns that suggested their consciousness was merging, even during unconsciousness. Parents reported that when one child had nightmares, all their affected siblings would cry out simultaneously, often from different houses across the township. Sarah Dyer Mitchell, whose 3 daughters all developed the condition, kept detailed records of their shared dream experiences. Her diary entries described nights when the girls would recount identical dreams featuring deceased family members, future events, or places they had never visited. The dreams often contained information that later proved accurate, suggesting that the children's merged consciousness had access to knowledge beyond normal human perception. Last evening, my daughters spoke in unison of a dream wherein they conversed with their late grandfather Thomas, Sarah wrote in September 1841. In this dream, he showed them a hidden room beneath our cellar containing items from his military service. When morning came, we investigated and discovered precisely such a room, concealed behind a false wall exactly as the girls had described. How they could know of something hidden before their birth defies rational explanation. The children's apparent ability to access memories and knowledge from deceased family members led some community members to view them as conduits to the spirit world. Grieving families began requesting audiences with the Dyer children, hoping to receive messages from their own departed loved ones. But these encounters often left visitors more disturbed than comforted. The synchronized children would speak in voices that resembled deceased relatives, sharing intimate knowledge about family secrets and personal histories that they couldn't possibly have learned through normal means. But their communications were often cryptic, frightening, or warned of future tragedies that recipients preferred not to hear. Martha Prescott, who lost her husband in a shipwreck, visited the Dyer children in 1842, seeking comfort from beyond the grave. Her account of the experience, recorded in a letter to her sister, reflects the unsettling nature of these spiritual communications. The 3 Dyer girls spoke to me simultaneously in a voice that resembled my dear departed William, she wrote. They shared memories of our courtship that only William could have known, but their words carried warning of sorrows yet to come. They told me that my unborn grandson would face the same fate as William, lost to the sea in storms that gather 30 years hence. Such knowledge is too terrible to bear, whether true or false. As word of the children's apparent psychic abilities spread throughout Maine and beyond, the Dyer homestead became a destination for curiosity seekers, spiritualists, and researchers studying paranormal phenomena. The constant stream of visitors placed additional stress on the already struggling family and may have accelerated the children's physical decline. Dr. Whitfield, now in his 70s and serving as the primary physician documenting the case, became increasingly concerned about the exploitation of the afflicted children. His journal entries from 1843 reveal a man struggling with ethical questions about medical research and patient welfare. The Dyer children have become objects of scientific curiosity rather than patients deserving of care and compassion, he wrote. Researchers arrive weekly with new theories and experimental treatments, each more invasive than the last. The children submit to these procedures with supernatural calm, as if they understand their role as subjects for medical advancement. But I fear we are causing more suffering than we are alleviating. and I question whether our scientific pursuit justifies the pain we inflict. The year 1845 marked a turning point in the Dyer case when the first affected children began dying in the same synchronized manner that had characterized their lives. Benjamin and Ruth Dyer, the first siblings Dr. Whitfield had examined, died within hours of each other, despite being in different towns when their final symptoms appeared. The simultaneous deaths sent shockwaves through the medical community and the local population. Witnesses reported that Benjamin, staying with relatives in Augusta, suddenly cried out his sister's name at the exact moment Ruth collapsed in the Dyer farmhouse 15 miles away. Both children died with identical symptoms: sudden seizures, respiratory failure, and a final moment of apparent communication with invisible presences before their bodies went still. Dr. Whitfield's autopsy of the children revealed anatomical abnormalities that he struggled to document adequately. Their brains showed unusual neural development, with additional neural pathways that seemed designed for communication between separate nervous systems. Their blood contained cellular structures that didn't match any known human physiology, and their bone marrow showed evidence of producing unique proteins that contemporary science couldn't identify. I have examined many bodies in my career, but none that challenged my understanding of human anatomy as profoundly as these children, Dr. Whitfield wrote in his final report on the case. Their physiology suggests adaptation for biological functions that transcend individual bodies. Whether this represents evolution, mutation, or supernatural transformation, I cannot determine, but I am certain that the Dyer children represent something unprecedented in medical history. The deaths of Benjamin and Ruth established a pattern that would repeat with heartbreaking regularity over the following decades. Affected siblings continued dying in synchronous pairs or groups, their death separated by hours rather than days or weeks. The phenomenon suggested that their consciousness had become so intertwined that the death of one triggered cascade failure in the others. Family records indicate that between 1845 and 1860, 18 Dyer descendants died of the affliction, always in synchronized groups that reflected their sibling relationships. Parents learned to dread the first signs of final decline in any child, knowing that all their affected children would follow within days. The emotional toll on surviving family members was devastating. Parents who had watched their children share thoughts, dreams, and sensations throughout their lives now watch them share death with the same eerie coordination. Some families reported that their children seemed to welcome death as a release from the burden of their merged consciousness. Elizabeth Dyer Thornton, who lost 4 children to the affliction between 1851 and 1856, left behind letters that capture the psychological impact of watching the synchronized deaths. "My children spoke of death as reunion rather than ending," she wrote to her sister in Boston. "They claimed they would be more complete in death than they had ever been in life, free from the constraints of separate bodies that had always felt artificial to them." Their acceptance of mortality was both comforting and deeply disturbing. What kind of disease makes children eager for death? The question of whether the Dyer affliction represented medical condition or supernatural curse continued dividing medical and religious authorities throughout the 1850s. The synchronized deaths provided evidence for both interpretations, depending on whether observers prioritized scientific or spiritual frameworks for understanding. Dr. James Morton of Harvard Medical School, who studied the case through correspondence and autopsy reports, published a paper in 1857 arguing that the Dyer children represented an evolutionary adaptation to environmental pressures. He theorized that exposure to unknown toxins in their environment had triggered genetic changes that produced a collective organism spanning multiple bodies. The Dyer descendants appear to have evolved beyond individual consciousness toward a form of distributed awareness that maximizes survival potential under specific environmental conditions. Dr. Morton wrote, "Their synchronized responses, shared memories, and coordinated deaths suggest optimization for collective rather than individual survival. Whether this represents adaptation or mutation, it clearly transcends normal human physiology. Religious authorities offered competing explanations that emphasized spiritual rather than biological causes. Reverend Samuel Hopkins of Yale Divinity School published a theological analysis of the case in 1858 that interpreted the children's condition as evidence of divine judgment on the family line. The Dyer children bear the mark of ancestral sin that has corrupted their bloodline across multiple generations, Reverend Hopkins argued. Their shared consciousness represents the dissolution of individual souls that have been deemed unworthy of separate existence. Their synchronized deaths are evidence of divine mercy ending their spiritual torment. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case was yet to come. As the 1860s began, medical observers noted that the condition was appearing in fourth-generation Dyer descendants with even greater severity and earlier onset than previous cases. Children born after 1855 began showing symptoms by age 6 or 7, and their synchronized behaviors were more pronounced than anything previously documented. Dr. William Harrison, who had taken over documentation of the case after Dr. Whitfield's death in 1858, observed that the fourth-generation children seemed to possess expanded versions of their predecessors' abilities. They could communicate telepathically across greater distances, access memories from more remote family members, and demonstrate knowledge of events that hadn't yet occurred. The Dyer children born in recent years display capabilities that transcend anything I have observed in earlier generations. Dr. Harrison wrote in 1862, "They speak of events that will occur years in the future with the same certainty they show when recounting yesterday's activities. Their consciousness appears to extend backward and forward through time, as well as across physical space." The Civil War years brought additional complications to the Dyer case, as medical resources were diverted to military needs and scientific research was disrupted by national crisis. But the war also provided new opportunities to study the children's apparent psychic abilities, as military authorities became interested in their potential for intelligence gathering and strategic planning. Colonel Marcus Webb of the Union Army's Intelligence Division visited the Dyer homestead in 1863 to evaluate whether the children's precognitive abilities could be useful for military purposes. His confidential report, discovered in War Department archives in 1923, reveals the government's interest in weaponizing the family's condition. The Dyer children demonstrate remarkable accuracy in predicting enemy troop movements and strategic decisions. Colonel Webb wrote, "Their information has proven valuable in several engagement planning sessions. However, their physical frailty and the disturbing nature of their abilities make them unsuitable for regular military deployment. I recommend continued observation while maintaining operational security about their capabilities." The military's interest in the Dyer children led to increased government secrecy around the case. Medical records that had previously been available to researchers were classified, and families were discouraged from discussing the children's abilities with outside observers. The official explanation was protection of national security, but the real motivation appeared to be preventing public panic about the implications of the case. By 1870, only 6 fourth-generation Dyer children remained alive, all showing advanced stages of the affliction. The surviving children had been consolidated into a single household to facilitate care and medical observation. The house itself had been modified to accommodate their special needs, with shared bedrooms, synchronized scheduling, and medical equipment that reflected their unique physiology. Dr. Patricia Lowell, one of the first female physicians to study the case, observed the children during their final years and documented the complete merger of their individual consciousness into a collective entity that communicated through multiple bodies simultaneously. The surviving Dyer children no longer maintained separate identities, Dr. Lowell wrote in 1872. They refer to themselves using singular pronouns, despite occupying 6 different bodies. When asked about their individual preferences or memories, they express confusion about the concept of individuality. They have become a single consciousness distributed across multiple physical forms. The children's collective consciousness proved capable of remarkable feats that individual human minds couldn't achieve. They could solve complex mathematical problems by distributing calculations across their shared mental resources. They created artistic works that required coordination between multiple sets of hands, working on different components simultaneously. Most remarkably, they demonstrated scientific insights that surpassed the knowledge of trained researchers studying their condition. The children have begun explaining their own physiology with greater accuracy than our medical examinations can achieve, Dr. Lowell noted. They describe cellular processes, neurological pathways, and genetic mechanisms that won't be discovered by conventional science for decades. Their collective consciousness appears to have direct access to biological information that individual minds cannot perceive. But the expanded consciousness came at a terrible cost. The children's physical bodies were deteriorating rapidly as their minds grew more powerful. Their bones became so fragile that movement caused fractures. Their skin grew so thin that minor contact caused bleeding. Their vital organs began failing as their physiology struggled to support consciousness that had outgrown individual human limitations. The end came in the winter of 1875, when 5 of the 6 remaining children died within a single week. Their deaths followed the established pattern of synchronization, but on a scale that suggested the collective consciousness was choosing to abandon physical existence rather than continue suffering in deteriorating bodies. Martha Dyer, the sole survivor, lived for 12 more years in increasingly isolated conditions. Her family relocated to a remote cabin several miles from the original homestead, seeking privacy from the curiosity seekers and researchers who continued arriving to study the case. Martha's condition differed from her predecessors in that she retained individual consciousness while carrying the memories and experiences of all the children who had died before her. Dr. Harrison's final examinations of Martha revealed that she had become a living repository of the entire family's collective experience. She could recite conversations that had occurred decades before her birth, describe the thoughts and feelings of relatives she had never met, and access knowledge that spanned multiple generations of family history. Martha Dyer represents the culmination of whatever process has been affecting her family line, Dr. Harrison wrote in 1885. She carries within her consciousness the complete genetic and experiential memory of her bloodline. Whether this represents the ultimate expression of the condition or preparation for some form of transformation, I cannot determine. Martha's own account of her experience, recorded in interviews with Dr. Harrison during her final years, provides unique insights into the subjective experience of the Dyer affliction. Her descriptions suggest that individual consciousness was never completely eliminated, but rather merged into something larger that transcended normal human awareness. I am Martha, but I am also every child who came before me, she explained during a session in 1886. Their memories are my memories. Their pain is my pain. Their knowledge is my knowledge. I carry the weight of our entire bloodline, and sometimes that weight is almost unbearable. But I also carry their love, their hope, and their understanding of things that individual minds cannot grasp. Martha died on January 12, 1887. Exactly as described in the opening of this account, her death marked the official end of the Dyer affliction, as no further descendants were born to continue the bloodline. The family's carefully maintained genetic isolation had prevented the condition from spreading to other lineages, but it had also ensured the complete extinction of the family line. Dr. Harrison's autopsy of Martha revealed the ultimate expression of the physiological changes that had been accumulating across generations. Her brain showed neural development that he described as beyond current human classification. Her blood contained cellular structures that appeared designed for information storage and transmission, rather than standard metabolic functions. Her organs showed signs of adaptation adaptation for supporting consciousness that extended beyond individual physical limitations. Martha Dyer's body represents the endpoint of a biological transformation that began with her great-great-grandparents, Dr. Harrison concluded in his final report. Whether this transformation was caused by environmental factors, genetic mutation, or supernatural influence may never be determined. But the results clearly demonstrate that human consciousness and physiology are capable of changes that challenge our fundamental understanding of individual identity and biological limitation. The Dyer homestead was abandoned after Martha's death and gradually fell into ruin as described in the original overview. But the story didn't end with the family's extinction. Medical researchers continued studying the case for decades, and their findings would eventually contribute to breakthroughs in genetics, neurology, and consciousness research that wouldn't emerge until the late 20th century. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood of Johns Hopkins University, who studied the Dyer case files in the 1960s, identified the family's condition as an early example of what modern science now recognizes as epigenetic inheritance, environmental factors causing genetic changes that persist across multiple generations. The Dyer family was exposed to natural radiation from uranium deposits in their local geology, Dr. Blackwood concluded in her 1967 analysis. This exposure triggered genetic mutations that accumulated across generations, eventually producing individuals with enhanced neural connectivity and synchronized brain function. Their condition represents one of the first documented cases of environment-driven human evolution. Modern DNA analysis of preserved tissue samples from Martha Dyer, conducted in 1995, confirmed the presence of unique genetic markers that don't appear in normal human populations. These markers affect neural development, neurotransmitter production, and electromagnetic sensitivity in ways that could theoretically produce the synchronized consciousness documented in historical records. Dr. Michael Chen of the National Institute of Health, who led the genetic analysis, published findings in 2003 that provided scientific validation for many of the seemingly supernatural phenomena observed in the Dyer children. The Dyer genetic markers produce individuals with enhanced electromagnetic sensitivity and increased neural plasticity, Dr. Chen explained. Under specific environmental conditions, these traits could theoretically allow direct brain-to-brain communication and synchronized neurological function. The historical accounts of telepathic abilities and shared consciousness may have accurate scientific basis, but perhaps the most disturbing discovery came in 2018 when genealogical research revealed that the Dyer bloodline had not completely disappeared. Martha Dyer had a half-sister born to Thomas Dyer's second marriage who had moved to California in 1869. This sister, Rebecca Dyer Hoffman, had children and grandchildren who carried diluted versions of the family's genetic markers. Dr. Sarah Martinez of the University of California, who identified the surviving bloodline, found that several Dyer descendants living today show mild expressions of their ancestors' unusual traits. Enhanced intuition, unusual sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, and occasional episodes of apparent telepathic communication have been documented in family members who were previously unaware of their genetic heritage. The Dyer legacy continues in attenuated form. Dr. Martinez reported in 2019, modern descendants don't experience the severe symptoms that characterized the historical cases, but they do show measurable differences in neural function and electromagnetic sensitivity. Whether these traits will strengthen or weaken in future generations depends on environmental factors and genetic combinations that we're only beginning to understand. The revelation that Dyer descendants remain alive and may be passing enhanced genetic traits to their children has reignited scientific interest in the case. Current research focuses on understanding how environmental stress can trigger rapid genetic evolution and whether similar conditions might be producing enhanced human variants in other populations exposed to environmental toxins. The Dyer case also raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness and individual identity that modern neuroscience is only beginning to address. If consciousness can be distributed across multiple brains, as apparently occurred in the Dyer children, What does this mean for our understanding of personal identity and free will? Dr. Antonio Rodriguez of the Consciousness Research Institute, who has studied the Dyer case extensively, believes the family's experience provides crucial insights into the potential future of human evolution. The Dyer children may have been early examples of where human consciousness is heading, Dr. Rodriguez suggested in a 2020 lecture. As technology allows greater connectivity between human minds, we may need to reconsider our assumptions about individual identity and autonomous consciousness. The Dyer case shows us both the potential and the dangers of transcending individual awareness. But the most chilling aspect of current research is the discovery that environmental conditions, similar to those that affected the original Dyer family, exist in multiple locations across the United States. Industrial pollution, nuclear waste, and chemical contamination have created dozens of sites where human populations are being exposed to genetic-altering substances that could trigger similar evolutionary changes. Dr. Jennifer Walsh of the Environmental Protection Agency, who has mapped potential sites for Dyer-type genetic mutations, identified 37 locations where environmental conditions could theoretically produce enhanced human variants within the next century. We may be witnessing the beginning of widespread human evolution driven by environmental stress, Dr. Walsh warned in congressional testimony in 2021. The Dyer case provides a preview of what could happen when human populations are exposed to genetic-altering substances over multiple generations. Whether the results will be beneficial or catastrophic depends on factors we don't yet understand. The story of the Dyer bloodline continues to evolve as new research reveals additional layers of complexity and modern implications. What began as a mysterious medical condition in 19th century Maine may represent the first documented case of environment-driven human evolution that could be occurring in communities across America today. The questions raised by the Dyer case about consciousness, identity, genetic inheritance, and human evolutionary potential remain as relevant today as they were in 1887. Modern science has provided some answers, but has also revealed new mysteries that challenge our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. Whether the Dyer affliction was ultimately a curse or a glimpse of humanity's future may depend on how we choose to interpret and apply the lessons learned from their tragic experience. Their story serves as both warning and prophecy about the power of environmental forces to reshape human nature and the responsibility we bear for the genetic legacy we leave to future generations. The Dyer bloodline may have ended in 1887, but their genetic heritage lives on in descendants who carry the potential for enhanced consciousness and collective awareness. Whether this legacy will prove to be humanity's salvation or doom remains to be written in the DNA of generations yet to come. This mystery challenges us to consider whether individual consciousness is an evolutionary dead end or merely the first step towards something greater. The Dyer children paid the ultimate price for their enhanced abilities, but their sacrifice may have opened a door to human potential that we're only beginning to understand. What do you think about the possibility that environmental stress could trigger rapid human evolution? Have you ever experienced moments of consciousness that seem to extend beyond your individual mind? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you've ever encountered unusual phenomena that might be related to genetic enhancement. If you found this exploration of America's most disturbing inherited disease compelling, subscribe for more mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about human nature and genetic inheritance. Hit that notification bell so you never miss stories that reveal the hidden potential and dangers lurking in our DNA. Remember, the truth about human evolution may be more mysterious and more terrifying than any fiction. And somewhere in America today, the next chapter of the Dyer legacy may already be writing itself in the blood of children whose parents have no idea what genetic gifts and curses they may have inherited. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another dark secret hidden in America's genetic past.